Romania is the only country in Eastern Europe where people speak a language descended from Latin. Surrounded on every side by Slavic and Hungarian and Turkish tongues, Romanian sits alone, an island of Romance grammar and vocabulary 1,000 miles from Rome. For over a century, the explanation taught in Romanian schools has been direct and a source of national pride. The Romans conquered Dacia, colonized it, and the Romanized population that emerged became the direct ancestors of every Romanian alive today. It is a clean story, a conquered people, absorbed so thoroughly into the Roman world that even their language surrendered. Ancient and modern DNA are now telling a different story. Not one that erases the Roman connection, but one considerably stranger than a simple case of conquest and replacement. To understand what is actually being questioned here, you have to understand who the Dacians were before Rome ever crossed the Danube. The Dacians were a Thracian-related Iron Age people occupying the Carpathian Basin and the lands north of the Danube, in what is now Romania and parts of surrounding countries. They were skilled metalworkers and farmers, built impressive fortified capitals in the Orishti Mountains, and worshipped a sky god named Zalmoxis whose cult, according to Greek sources, involved beliefs about the soul surviving death that struck outside observers as strikingly similar to later philosophical and religious ideas emerging elsewhere in the ancient world. By the 1st century BCE, under the leadership of a king named Burebista, they had built a genuinely formidable regional power. Fortified mountain strongholds, control over Black Sea trade routes, and enough military strength that Julius Caesar himself, according to Roman sources, was reportedly planning a Dacian campaign before his assassination cut the plan short. Dacia's most famous ruler, Decebalus, spent decades resisting Roman expansion with a combination of diplomacy, tribute negotiation, and outright war, humiliating one Roman emperor, Domitian, badly enough that Rome agreed to pay Dacia an annual subsidy just to keep the peace. An arrangement later emperors found politically unbearable. It was Trajan, not Caesar, who finally conquered Dacia in 2 brutal campaigns between 101 and 106 CE. A conquest so significant to Rome that it was commemorated with an entire monumental column in the heart of the capital. Trajan's Column, its spiraling relief still depicting Dacian warriors, fortresses, and the final defeat of Decebalus, who took his own life rather than be captured. Roman sources claim the conquest brought back so much captured Dacian gold that it single-handedly funded a wave of construction projects across the empire, including Trajan's own Forum. Rome held Dacia as a province for roughly 165 years, a relatively short occupation by Roman imperial standards, before withdrawing its administration and legions south of the Danube in 271 CE under pressure from Gothic incursions. That withdrawal is the detail that makes the traditional story genuinely puzzling once you sit with it. A century and a half of Roman rule, followed by over 1,000 years during which the region was overrun by successive waves of migrating peoples. Goths, Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars, Magyars, Pechenegs, Cumans, and eventually Mongols. And yet, according to the traditional continuity narrative, the Latin language planted during that relatively brief occupation survived every single one of those waves, intact, eventually emerging as modern Romanian. This is either a remarkable act of linguistic and demographic persistence, or the story has a piece missing. The genetic picture that has emerged from research on modern Romanian populations, along with the limited ancient DNA available from the broader Dacian and Thracian cultural sphere, points toward something more layered than either pure continuity or pure population replacement. Modern Romanians, genetically, sit firmly within the broader Southeastern European genetic cluster. Their closest genetic neighbors are not Italians. They are other Balkan populations, Bulgarians, Serbians, and populations across the former Yugoslav region, reflecting deep shared ancestry across the Balkan Peninsula that long predates Rome entirely. This is, on its own, not surprising. Geography predicts genetic proximity in almost every population on Earth, and Romania's Balkan neighbors would be expected to share ancestry regardless of any Roman involvement at all. What is more striking is what the data does not show in significant quantity. A strong, distinct genetic signal connecting modern Romanians specifically to the Italian peninsula, of the kind you would expect if Roman colonial settlement had genuinely and substantially replaced or diluted the pre-existing Dacian population during the province's century and a half of administration. The Roman colonization of Dacia, historical sources tell us, did involve importing settlers from across the empire. Veterans, administrators, miners brought in for the province's valuable gold deposits, and colonists from various Roman provinces including parts of Italy, Syria, and North Africa. But the genetic footprint of this colonial population, if we look for it specifically as an Italian signal, appears far more modest than the traditional Romanization narrative implies. This lines up with a genetic study relevant to the broader Thracian Dacian cultural zone, published in Scientific Reports, which analyzed ancient mitochondrial genomes recovered from Thracian period burial sites in Bulgaria. That research found deep continuity between ancient Thracian-era maternal lineages and the maternal lineages carried by modern populations across the wider Balkan and Carpathian region. Continuity that predates Roman contact by centuries and persists in the genetic record well past it. The indigenous population, in other words, did not vanish. It absorbed newcomers, contributed to the region's later demographic layers, including the Slavic-speaking populations that arrived from the 6th century onward and remained, at the level of deep ancestry, substantially in place. Here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because it forces a question that the traditional continuity narrative never had to confront directly. If the genetic population of the region shows substantial continuity from the pre-Roman Dacian and Thracian era straight through the medieval period, largely unbroken by a decisive Roman replacement event, then how did a Latin-derived language end up being the one that survived all of it? The honest scientific answer is that we do not yet have a definitive resolution, because the ancient DNA record specifically from Dacian period sites north of the Danube remains far thinner than the ancient DNA record for populations like the Etruscans or the Gauls, where large systematic studies with dozens of samples spanning centuries have already been published. What exists is largely inferential, drawn from the broader Thracian genetic sphere, from modern Romanian population genetics, and from the documented patterns of Roman provincial demography elsewhere in the empire. A comprehensive, large-scale ancient DNA study specifically targeting Dacian period and post-withdrawal Roman Dacian sites has not yet been published with the depth that would let researchers speak with the same confidence they now have about Iron Age Gaul or Etruria. What the available evidence does support, cautiously, is a picture closer to what happened with Latin in several other corners of the Roman world, a linguistic transformation achieved primarily through cultural and administrative dominance rather than large-scale population replacement. Latin became the language of law, trade, the military, and eventually the church across enormous stretches of the empire where the underlying population remained, genetically, substantially what it had always been. Gaul adopted Latin and became French while remaining genetically continuous with its Iron Age Celtic-speaking population. Iberia adopted Latin and became Spanish and Portuguese, while remaining genetically continuous with its pre-Roman population. There is no genetic reason to assume Dacia would have been fundamentally different, and the limited evidence available leans toward the same pattern, language shifting on top of a population that stayed largely in place. This does not answer why Latin specifically survived the collapse of Roman administration in Dacia when the Roman legions and governors withdrew south of the Danube in 271 CE, while so many other Romanized provinces eventually shifted to other languages entirely under later conquest. That question remains genuinely open, and Romanian historians and linguists have proposed several explanations. A possible retreat of Latin-speaking populations into the more defensible Carpathian highlands during the turbulent centuries of migration period invasions, continued contact with Latin-speaking populations south of the Danube in the Roman successor territories, or a longer, more gradual, process of Romanization that continued informally even after direct administrative control ended. None of these explanations currently has the kind of definitive ancient DNA support that would let a documentary confidently declare the matter settled, and any honest account of the Dacian question has to sit with that uncertainty rather than paper over it. What ancient and modern genetics can say with real confidence is this: The population living in the Carpathian Basin today is not simply the descendant of imported Roman colonists who replaced a defeated native people. The deep roots trace back through the Dacians and their Thracian relatives, through populations that were already ancient by the time Trajan's legions crossed the Danube, through a Balkan and Carpathian genetic landscape that has remained remarkably stable across more than 2,000 years of invasion, migration, empire, and collapse. The Latin that survives in modern Romanian is a genuine historical inheritance, but the population speaking it is not primarily descended from the people who brought that Latin north of the Danube. It is descended, overwhelmingly, from the people who were already standing on that land when the Romans arrived, and who were still standing on it in substantially the same genetic configuration, long after the legions marched south for the final time. This is not a diminishment of Romanian identity. It may, in fact, be a more remarkable story than the one currently taught. A population that absorbed a colonial language during a relatively brief imperial occupation held onto it through 1,000 years of subsequent invasion by peoples who spoke nothing resembling Latin, and emerged on the other side of that millennium as the sole Romance-speaking nation in an entire region of Slavic and Hungarian and Turkish tongues. Not because Rome replaced them, but because something about the way that language took root made it more durable than the empire that planted it. The column that Trajan raised in Rome to commemorate his Dacian conquest still stands in the shadow of modern office buildings, its spiral relief circling upward with scenes of Roman engineers building bridges, Dacian warriors defending mountain fortresses, and a king's final refusal to be taken alive. It was built to tell one story to every Roman who walked past it for the next 2,000 years. Total conquest, total absorption, an empire erasing a resistant people and replacing them with something new and thoroughly Roman. The DNA, drawn from Thracian and Balkan burial sites, and cross-referenced against the genetics of the 20 million people who call themselves Romanian today, tells something closer to the opposite. The people did not disappear into the empire that conquered them. The empire's language survived, but the population that speaks it now is largely the same population that Trajan's legions found already living along the Carpathian Mountains. A people who took what Rome brought, kept it long after Rome itself was gone, and remained, underneath the borrowed grammar, exactly who they had always been. The full genetic picture of ancient Dacia is still being written, one excavation and one ancient genome at a time. Future large-scale studies, of the kind that already exist for Iron Age Gaul and Etruria, may eventually give researchers the same confidence about the Carpathian Basin that they now have about those better sampled regions. Until then, what has already emerged is enough to suggest that Trajan's column, for all its triumphant spiraling detail, may have been telling only half the story the bones were prepared to tell.